The desert winds howled across the barren landscape of Arizona Territory in the autumn of 1887, carrying with them the scent of sage and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Thomas Mackenzie pulled his weathered coat tighter around his shoulders as he guided his horse through the rocky terrain, the familiar weight of his Winchester rifle resting across his lap. The storm clouds gathered overhead like dark omens, and he knew he needed to find shelter soon. Thomas had been riding for 3 days straight, returning from a cattle drive that had taken him clear to Tucson. His ranch, the Circle M, lay another 20 miles ahead through treacherous canyon country. At 42 years old, he had weathered many storms in this unforgiving land, but something about this particular evening felt different. The air crackled with an electric tension that made his horse, Ranger, skittish and nervous. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Thomas spotted something unusual in the distance. Through the gathering gloom, he could make out a figure huddled beneath a rocky overhang. His hand instinctively moved to his rifle, for in this territory, strangers could mean trouble. Apache raiders still roamed these parts, despite the government's claims that they had all been relocated to reservations. Only last month, the Hendersons' spread had been attacked, leaving 2 dead and their livestock scattered to the 4 winds. But as Thomas drew closer, he realized the figure was not a warrior preparing an ambush. It was a woman, and she was clearly in distress. Her long black hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her clothes were torn and mud-stained. She clutched a bundle to her chest with trembling hands, and when she looked up at his approach, Thomas saw eyes that held depths of sorrow he had rarely encountered. The woman was Apache. That much was clear from her high cheekbones and bronze skin. But there was something else about her, something that made Thomas hesitate before reaching for his weapon. She made no move to flee or fight, simply watched him with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope that tugged at something deep in his chest. Lightning split the sky above them, illuminating the stark landscape in brilliant white. In that moment of clarity, Thomas saw the bundle she held was moving slightly. A child, he realized, probably no more than a year old. The woman was protecting her baby from the storm, and from the looks of her, she had been out in the elements for days. Thomas had heard the stories that circulated through the territory about Apache women who had been cast out from their tribes. Some said they were cursed, marked by tragedy that followed them like a shadow. Others claimed they brought death to anyone who showed them kindness. The superstitions ran deep among both the white settlers and the remaining Apache bands, creating outcasts who belonged nowhere. But looking at this woman and her child, shivering in the growing storm, Thomas found he cared little for superstitions. His own wife, Sarah, had died 3 years ago from fever, and since then, the ranch had felt like a tomb. Perhaps it was the loneliness talking, or perhaps it was simply the decent thing to do, but he knew he could not leave them out here to face the storm alone. Dismounting slowly, Thomas raised his hands to show he meant no harm. The woman watched his every movement, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm, cutting through the sound of the wind. "Mom, this storm's going to get worse before it gets better. I've got a ranch about 20 miles from here, with warm food and a dry roof. You and your little one are welcome to shelter there until it passes." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might refuse. But then another crack of thunder rolled across the sky, and the baby in her arms began to cry. The sound seemed to break something inside her, and she nodded once, slowly. Getting her onto his horse proved to be a challenge. The woman was weak from exposure and hunger, and she refused to let go of her child even for a moment. Thomas finally managed to lift them both onto Ranger's back, settling the woman in front of him with the baby cradled between them. The intimate arrangement felt strange after so many years of solitude, but Thomas pushed the thought aside and focused on the dangerous ride ahead. The storm hit in earnest as they made their way through Devil's Canyon, a treacherous stretch of narrow paths and loose rock that claimed lives regularly. Thomas had to trust Ranger's instincts as they picked their way through the darkness, the rain coming down so hard it felt like needles against their skin. Several times, loose rocks cascaded down from the canyon walls, missing them by mere feet. Through it all, the Apache woman remained silent, but Thomas could feel the tension in her body as she struggled to protect her child from the elements. Her strength impressed him. Most people, man or woman, would have been sobbing or begging for mercy by now, but this woman endured the hardship with a stoic dignity that spoke of inner steel. It was well past midnight when they finally reached the Circle M. The ranch house sat in a small valley, protected by hills on three sides and a creek that ran year-round. Thomas had built it himself after the war, using stone from the local quarry and timber hauled down from the mountains. It was not a grand structure, but it was solid and warm, with windows that caught the morning sun and a wide porch where he used to sit with Sarah in the evenings. The woman seemed to revive slightly as they approached the house, her head lifting to take in their surroundings. Thomas helped her down from the horse, noting how carefully she moved, as if every muscle in her body ached. The baby had fallen asleep during the ride, exhausted by the ordeal. Inside, Thomas quickly built up the fire and lit several oil lamps, filling the main room with warm, golden light. The woman stood uncertainly near the door, still clutching her child, as if she expected to be turned away at any moment. Her dark hair dripped steadily onto the wooden floor, and Thomas could see she was shivering despite her efforts to appear strong. "Please, sit by the fire," Thomas said, gesturing to the chair closest to the hearth. "I'll get you some dry clothes and something hot to eat." The woman moved slowly toward the fire, her eyes taking in every detail of the room. Thomas wondered what she saw when she looked at his home. The furniture was simple, but well made, mostly pieces he had crafted himself during the long winter evenings. Sarah's touches were still evident in the hand-sewn curtains and the small garden visible through the kitchen window, though it had grown wild in the years since her death. From his bedroom, Thomas retrieved one of Sarah's dresses, a simple blue cotton that he had never been able to bring himself to give away. It would be too large for the Apache woman, who was smaller and more delicate than his wife had been, but it would be dry and warm. He also found a soft blanket that would serve for the baby. When he returned to the main room, he found the woman had moved her chair so she could watch both the door and the windows. It was a precaution born of experience, Thomas realized. She had learned to never let her guard down completely, even in apparent safety. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently as he handed her the clothes. The woman looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her English was clear and precise. "Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom." "That's a beautiful name," Thomas replied. "I'm Thomas Mackenzie. This is my ranch, the Circle M." Ayana nodded once, then looked down at the clothes in her hands. "You are not afraid of me?" The question caught Thomas off guard. "Should I be?" Something flickered across Ayana's face, an expression too complex for Thomas to decipher. "Many people say I am cursed, that death follows me like a shadow." Thomas considered her words carefully. In this territory, superstition often held more sway than reason, and he had heard the stories about Apache women who had been marked by tragedy. But looking at Ayana, holding her sleeping child with such fierce protectiveness, he found it hard to believe she could bring harm to anyone. "I don't put much stock in curses," Thomas said finally, "but I do believe in helping folks who need it. Why don't you get changed into those dry clothes, and I'll fix us something to eat." While Ayana changed behind a blanket Thomas had hung for privacy, he busied himself in the kitchen. The larder was well stocked with beans, salt pork and cornmeal, the staples of frontier life. He put together a simple but hearty stew, letting it simmer while he prepared coffee and biscuits. The familiar routines of cooking helped calm his nerves, though he found his mind racing with questions about his unexpected guests. When Ayana emerged, transformed by the dry clothes and the warmth of the fire, Thomas was struck by her beauty. Sarah's dress hung loose on her slight frame, but it brought out the warm tones in her skin and the lustrous quality of her now drying hair. She had managed to fashion a sling for her baby from part of the blanket, keeping the child close while freeing her hands. They ate in companionable silence, the storm continuing to rage outside. Thomas found himself stealing glances at Ayanna, intrigued by her quiet dignity and the way she seemed to notice every detail of her surroundings. She ate with obvious hunger but maintained perfect manners, and she made sure her baby was fed and comfortable before seeing to her own needs. It was only when they had finished the meal that Ayanna began to speak, and when she did, her story unfolded like a dark flower blooming in the lamplight. She had been married to a warrior named Nal-Nish, she told Thomas, a man respected among their band for his courage and wisdom. They had been happy together, blessed with a love that seemed to defy the hardships of their people's changing world. But happiness, Ayanna had learned, was a fragile thing in a land where conflict and disease stalked the unwary. The sickness had come to their band like a thief in the night, striking down the young and old alike. Despite the efforts of the medicine men, people began dying within days of showing the first symptoms. Nal-Nish had been among the first to fall, his strong body no match for the invisible enemy that ravaged their community. As Ayanna spoke, her voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the pain that flickered in her eyes. She had watched her husband die, helpless to save him despite her knowledge of healing herbs and traditional remedies. And when others in the band began to whisper that she had brought the sickness upon them, that her presence was cursed, she had been forced to make an impossible choice. "They said I must leave," Ayanna said, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "The elders decided that my sorrow had opened a door for evil spirits to enter our camp. They gave me one day to gather my possessions and go." Thomas felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it. To cast out a grieving widow with a young child seemed cruel beyond measure, even allowing for the desperation that disease could breed in a community. But he kept his feelings to himself, sensing that Ayanna needed to tell her story without interruption. She had been wandering for weeks, Ayanna continued, moving from place to place, but finding no welcome anywhere. Word of her supposed curse had spread among the Apache bands, and even those who might have shown pity were afraid to risk their own people's safety. The white settlements were equally unwelcoming, viewing any Apache as a potential threat regardless of circumstances. "I began to think that perhaps they were right," Ayanna said, looking down at her sleeping child. "Perhaps I'm cursed. Everywhere I go, I bring only trouble and fear." Thomas leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face serious in the firelight. "Now you listen to me, Ayanna. What happened to your people wasn't your fault. Disease doesn't care about curses or spirits. It just takes whoever it can get, good folks and bad alike. I've seen enough of death to know that much." Ayanna raised her eyes to meet his, and Thomas saw a flicker of hope there, quickly suppressed. "You do not know me, Thomas Mackenzie. You do not know what I have seen, what I have done." "No, then tell me," Thomas said simply. For a moment Ayanna was silent, studying his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Then, slowly, she began to speak again, her voice taking on a rhythm that reminded Thomas of the storytellers he had heard around campfires during his army days. She told him about the vision that had come to her the night before Nal-Nish fell ill, a dream so vivid it had seemed more real than waking life. In the vision, she had seen a great darkness spreading across the land, swallowing everything in its path. She had tried to warn her husband, but he had dismissed her fears as the product of worry and exhaustion. When the sickness began claiming lives, some remembered her warning and began to whisper that she had brought the very calamity she had foreseen. The fact that she and her child had remained healthy while others died only reinforced their suspicions. In their grief and desperation, the band had needed someone to blame, and Ayanna had become the convenient target. As she spoke, Thomas found himself drawn deeper into her story, captivated by the quiet strength in her voice and the way the firelight played across her features. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the house, but inside, the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the sleeping child. After they cast me out, Ayana continued, I went to the reservation at San Carlos, thinking perhaps the Indian agent would help me. But the conditions there were terrible, Thomas. People were dying from hunger and disease, crowded together like animals. I could not bear to see my child grow up in such a place. So she had left again, this time heading north toward the Mogollon Mountains, hoping to find relatives among the bands that still lived free in the wilderness. But winter was coming, and the army patrols were increasing their efforts to round up any remaining Apache holdouts. Ayana had been forced to keep moving, never staying in one place long enough to truly rest. I was trying to reach the camp of my cousin Geronimo, she said, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of the legendary war chief. But the soldiers were everywhere, and I became lost in the canyons. When the storm came, I thought surely we would die. Thomas absorbed this information carefully. If Ayana was related to Geronimo, even distantly, it could complicate things considerably. The army was still hunting the old warrior and his followers, and anyone connected to him would be viewed with extreme suspicion by the authorities. But looking at this woman, exhausted and alone with her child, Thomas found it hard to see her as a threat to anyone. Whatever her connections, she was clearly more in need of help than capable of providing aid to hostile raiders. How old is your baby? Thomas asked, partly to change the subject, and partly because he was genuinely curious about the child who had slept so peacefully through their conversation. Ayana's face softened as she looked down at the bundle in her arms. She will be 1 year when the snow comes to the mountains. Her name is Itzel, which means rainbow. Indeed, that's a pretty name for a pretty little girl, Thomas said, and he was surprised to realize he meant it. There was something about this small family that had already begun to work its way into his heart, despite the potential complications their presence might bring. They talked for another hour as the storm raged outside, sharing stories of their different worlds and finding unexpected common ground. Thomas told Ayana about his years as a cavalry scout during the Apache Wars, carefully omitting the details of specific battles or raids. He spoke instead about the beauty of the land they both loved and the challenges of making a life in such an unforgiving place. Ayana, in turn, shared stories of her childhood, painting a picture of Apache life that was far more complex and nuanced than the savage portrayals Thomas had grown up with. She spoke of the careful balance her people maintained with the natural world, of ceremonies that marked the changing seasons, and of the deep bonds that held families and clans together through good times and bad. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself increasingly aware of the unusual situation he had created by bringing Ayana and her child to his ranch. In a territory where tensions between whites and Apaches ran high, harboring a woman connected to Geronimo could be seen as treasonous by some. But the more he talked with Ayana, the more convinced he became that he had made the right choice. Finally, as exhaustion began to overtake them both, Thomas showed Ayana to the small guest room where she and Itzel could sleep safely. The room had been Sarah's sewing room, filled with her threads and fabrics and the partially completed quilt she had been working on when she died. Thomas had left everything exactly as it was, unable to bear the thought of disturbing her things. But now, watching Ayana settle her child on the narrow bed and carefully arrange the blankets, Thomas felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 3 years, the room felt alive again, filled with purpose instead of just memories. "Thank you," Ayana said simply, as Thomas prepared to leave her to rest. "I know the risk you take by helping us." Thomas paused in the doorway, considering her words. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks," he said finally. "My Sarah always said that kindness was never wasted, even when it wasn't returned." As he closed the door behind him, Thomas heard Ayana begin to sing softly to her daughter, a haunting Apache lullaby that seemed to capture all the sorrow and hope of her journey. The melody followed him to his own room, where he lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm and thinking about the changes this night had brought to his carefully ordered life. Outside, the wind howled like something wild and untamed, But inside the Circle M ranch, two lost souls had found temporary shelter from the storm. Neither Thomas nor Ayana knew what the morning would bring, but for now, it was enough that they were warm and safe and no longer alone. The storm would pass, as all storms do, but the ripples it had set in motion would change everything for the lonely rancher and the Apache widow he had chosen to help. In the days to come, Thomas would learn that some risks are worth taking, and Ayana would discover that not all white men were her enemies. Together, they would face challenges that would test their courage, their convictions, and ultimately, their hearts. But that is a story for tomorrow. Tonight, they slept peacefully for the first time in longer than either could remember, protected by walls of stone and timber from the fury of the desert storm, and perhaps from the harsh judgments of a world that had no place for love that crossed the boundaries of race and culture. The morning would bring new decisions and new dangers, but it would also bring the first tentative steps toward a bond that would surprise them both with its strength and depth. For now, though, the Circle M ranch held its secrets close, sheltering two people who had found each other in the darkness and discovered that sometimes the most unlikely companions make the strongest allies. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to weaken, Thomas Mackenzie slept dreamlessly for the first time since his wife's death, while in the next room, Ayana held her daughter close and dared to hope that their long journey through the wilderness might finally be coming to an end.